Well, hello there, and welcome back to our Witches, Cunning Folk and Magic theme. And in this second episode, I'm talking to Willow Winsham, an author and historian specialising in folklore and the history of the English witch trials. Her books include the highly popular Treasury of Folklore series from Batsford Books and accused British witches throughout history from Pen and Sword Books. Her passion for uncovering fascinating topics and dedication to impeccable research guarantees an accessible and engaging read, whatever the subject. Willow is also the co-founder of the Folklore Thursday hashtag, the popular website and social media phenomenon dedicated to sharing folklore, fairy tales and traditions from across the globe. When not writing, Willow spends her time crocheting, delving into family history research and indulging in ever-growing board game habit. And she lives in Derbyshire with her 3 children and 2 British Shorthair cats. But in this chat, we're going to talk about how witches appear in history, why there is such an ongoing fascination with the witch, and specifically we're going to talk about Helen Duncan, the last woman tried under the 1735 Witchcraft Act, among many things. Enjoy! Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Hello and welcome to Fabulous Folklore. How are you doing?
Hi Icy, thank you so much for having me. I'm doing well today, thank you. How are you?
I'm not too bad. And I know we said this before we started recording, but I think it's hilarious that we've known each other online for about 10 years and this is the first time we've properly talked.
Yes, but better late than never and all that, and hopefully the first time of many.
Exactly. And in that time, obviously, you've written a bunch of books. And I know there's a whole load of the Treasury of Folklore books as well, but we're going to focus on the witch ones that you've done. And you've written, so there was Accused British Witches Through History, and then there was England's Witchcraft Trials, and now most recently you've done the Story of Witches, Folklore, History and Superstition. Clearly there's an interest in witches, I think we can agree on. Why is it, do you think, that there's such a persistent interest in witches, and have you noticed that change in the type of interest, or are people just like, I want to know all things witches?
Well, I think on a personal level, to start with, one of the reasons my interest continues is due to the fact there's such a sheer amount of information and sources out there, and so many different angles and paths to explore. Even with the intense academic interest in witches and the history of witchcraft over the last decade or so, so there's been so many books, so many articles, and now with obviously online sources and things, there's just so much that you can access. Even with that, we've only really barely scratched the surface in a lot of ways. It's a topic that's just evolving continuously, and for this reason alone, I think it's always going to draw interest because it just, well, it never stops. It's never ending. As we're saying, been 10 years between Accused and the Story of Witches this year, and at no point over that time was there even a moment where it looked like the interest was waning. It wasn't like, oh, witches aren't really a in topic anymore, which you get with quite a lot of other subjects and things. And I think, yeah, the sheer wealth of the information out there and the continual discovery and change, it never stops. It's not we know everything we need to know now. It just keeps on going. And I think people in general, the enduring nature of that interest is, I think in essence, it's timeless because so many of the issues that are highlighted by the witch trials and persecution of people labelled as witches, they're ongoing. They're ongoing issues throughout history, right up to now. Intolerance, persecution, injustice, inequality. There's never a point where these aren't relevant. And I think whilst these issues exist, and I think they're always going to exist to some extent, then witches are going to continue to be of interest and be relevant, essentially.
So what first got you interested in witches then, as an academic subject?
Mm. I always laugh in a way because when it comes to looking at witches from a historical and academic perspective, it was quite a late development. I mean, history's been my background and interest from the get-go. But when I was doing my degree when I was at university, I did women's history for dissertation subject, and it got to the picking your dissertation topic. And I always say this, pretty much everyone else jumped on the witches or prostitutes bandwagon. And being me, I went, no, everybody else is doing that. I'm not touching that with a barge pole. And quite categorically went, no, doing something else, and did my dissertation on the 18th century reformer Hannah More and her pamphlets, which was, really interesting, but nothing to do with witches. Which is ironic looking back. It was several years after that that I was writing a fiction project, and one of the characters, as I was writing, I was like, oh, they seem to be a bit witchy. Oh, okay, I've got a witch in my story now. And with everything I do, I researched the topic to death, and in doing so, went, oh, okay, this is where I'm meant to be, and fell down the rabbit hole, and have not come out since. Ditched the fiction project, that never saw the light of day. But yeah, from that point on, I was like, this is where my interest is, and it's not showing any sign of stopping. So
Cool. So obviously I've got a copy of The Story of Witches, and I did do a review of it, which I'll try and remember to put at the end of the episode. But if I don't, it is on Instagram, I think. But in short, you've divided The Story of Witches into sort of three sections to group the content together because it's such a huge topic. So you've obviously got kind of witches in the ancient world, but I think more of like the mythic sense of witches. Then you've got sort of the more realistic witch trial historical witch section, and then the contemporary witchcraft and the figures involved with that, its revival, so the likes of Gerald Gardner and so on. And I think in a lot of ways, looking at it, that's probably the only way that you could structure that amount of information. But what led you to that kind of structure when you had so much material to work with?
largely, it was a case of trial and error and moving around the material to see where it worked and how it all hung together. I mean, initially, there were key things that I knew I wanted to include and needed to include. And then it was a case of, right, here's what I've got. What are the common themes? How will this break down sort of naturally? I mean, the problem, as you've rightly said, is all writers know is having not too little, but too much potential content, and finding a way to showcase what I'd selected, but also constructing a coherent narrative that sort of, flowed through the book. I'm not going to lie, it was quite a challenge because, like you say, there was so much out there. And I really needed to avoid the issue from the start of muddying the waters between the fictional representations of witches, the very real beliefs and fears about witches and witchcraft over time, and again, the very real and relevant spiritual and religious beliefs of those who identify as and with witches today. And blurring the lines between those was something that I was really keen to avoid. So it was important to do justice to all three of those strands, but also whilst highlighting connections and common themes, not making connections where there weren't any. So loosely speaking, it sort of fell into fictional and fairy tale witches, beliefs about witches in the real world, and then the reclamation of and the modern era of the witch, which then generally sort of fell into a nice semi-chronological approach, as you mentioned in the question. I mean, there's a bit of overlap. So in the modern fairy tales, in the first section, obviously, that's not in a chronological sense. And in the witch trial section, you've got testing witches from the 19th and 20th centuries, which again sort of jumps about a bit into the modern era, but generally it organised itself almost into that sort of semi-chronological order, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And I think it was really interesting viewing them in that way because I think each kind of put them into their own context. But then for me, it showed that there wasn't actually that much of a through line between these sort of three areas. And I know there's some people still cling desperately to this idea of this eternal, unchanging witchcraft stretching back into antiquity despite the lack of evidence for it. And I thought it was really interesting the way you did the book. It was like, well, clearly that line that people are believing is there obviously isn't. It doesn't show up like that. So what is it about that idea, do you think, that's so attractive to people that makes them want to see it where it perhaps maybe actually isn't?
Well, I think the major influence in all of that is, and I know you're already familiar with this, is the Margaret Murray effect.
Oh yeah, Margaret
Yeah,
Murray, not a friend of the podcast.
no, the elephant in the room, yes. And yeah, her ideas of the existence of a witch cult which dated back into antiquity managed to survive the witch trial period by going underground and emerging triumphant with the advent of Wicca. The essence of the idea and the strands of the idea were there beforehand, but it was her work really, that launched it to such a wide audience. And it was a receptive audience. I think that's the thing. I mean, when you think her in encyclopedia entry, it was a definitive explanation for what witchcraft was for years. And even though she so badly interpreted and misunderstood a lot of the sources she used, and the fact that her work and her arguments, they don't stand up to rigorous scrutiny. Sometimes you can't beat, popular opinion. There are always rumblings and criticisms against her work, even from the get-go. And there's a lot more awareness today that Murray's work and her ideas, shouldn't be taken as gospel or anything close. But in many ways, it's still, I think, something of a losing battle, because people wanted to believe it. And they want to believe it. You can see why the idea of this unbroken, stuff the patriarchy, we are the witches you didn't burn tradition, it really speaks to people to be part of something greater than our individual selves. I think this long unbroken line of individuals sharing their magic and their wisdom down through the generations. I think that whole idea, it's a really powerful thing, that it speaks to people, and it's sunk its claws in so much that even when faced with the fact that actually there isn't the evidence to support that, a lot of people, well, they either haven't heard that, or they don't want to believe that. And especially if it's something that has become a huge part of your own identity and your own journey and your own story, it almost in some ways doesn't matter. I think it becomes about people's individual narratives and their own sort of place in their own kind of story, which is a topic that way too big for now. But I think linked to that, when it comes to sort of another strand of it, is the persecution of witches, mostly women, but also men and children, because of the horrendous acts so unjustly treated. There's almost some solace and some almost poetic justice in the idea that it wasn't all for nothing. If there is this long continuous line, there's almost like some point to it all. They weren't just senseless victims. Something came from it. You've gone from the darkness into the light. Otherwise, it just all feels, in many ways, incredibly grim, which, of course, the reality, it was senseless, it was pointless, and it's a reality that's really quite hard to stomach. I think, though, there is a real danger of mythologizing, if that's even a word, the witches of the past, and putting an agenda on them that in most cases just wasn't there. Because what we often forget is the vast majority of those accused, they didn't see themselves as witches, they didn't identify as witches, and they weren't purposefully carrying out acts that they saw as witchcraft. They often came to identify with the label put on them by others, but they didn't see themselves as part of a bigger, wider, subversive movement. And yeah, it's that tricky line, isn't it, between appropriating the past to help us understand ourselves and our modern mindset and everything. So whilst the stories about witches and everything are fascinating, this is another side line that's also really interesting, how people respond to that, how they use that. Yeah, and it's just really fascinating. I don't know if that answered your question or not.
I think one of the things, obviously, because you and I obviously both also look at folklore as well, and I think there is a massive difference between people passing on traditional knowledge or like family customs and family recipes and things from one generation. There's a very massive difference between that, which I think is actually quite human to do that. And
Definitely.
there's a huge difference between that. And obviously there is some evidence of things like that with like family cookbooks and so on.
Yeah.
So, and obviously I know in other cultures they will have these traditions of passing knowledge on. So obviously we are very much speaking in quite a British witchcraft context here, just in case anyone.
Yeah.
But I think, yeah, it is a nice sort of thing to think, or, were they part of this grander whole? But I think for me, where I start getting a bit undone is when it then becomes like a way of, oh, let's have a go at Christianity, and oh, let's romanticize the pagans. And I'm always like, but which pagans? Because obviously when the Romans arrived, they were pagans, the Saxons were pagans, the Iron Age Britons were pagans. Which ones do you mean? And that's where I get a little bit sort of, I find that's the bit for me where it kind of falls apart, where people have invented this past, or they've clung to part of that past, and then it's like, that's interesting, you're allowed to find that interesting, but there's the through line from, say, Iron Age Britain to like 19th century England is quite a wide gap of time.
Yes. And then, like you say, if it's a pet peeve of mine on any level, is taking things like that and using it as a stick to beat other groups with. And I don't agree with that either way, especially when a lot of the information is not necessarily correct. Easter memes. I will go no further. I will go no further. Yeah. Yeah. Mm.
Yeah, I've seen some absolute doozies about Friday the 13th and where it allegedly came from, and you sit there going, no, no, and thrice no. And I think
Mhm.
because it's so easy for people to just put something out there, and it could be something that at best before the internet would have been a brain fart, but now it becomes an Instagram meme and people don't check them. And of course, now we have the added bonus of the AI overview just flat out making stuff up. It's obviously only going to get worse.
Yes. Oh my goodness, yes. Folklore Thursday, etc. Absolutely. Obviously, love it. The community feel, all of that, the sharing of information is wonderful. But social media is a double-edged sword because it's so easy to post anything and then it's been shared however many times. And suddenly that's become a fact that you're like, where did that information come from? And I imagine we're all guilty of it on some level. I look back sometimes, well, I look back at Accused, and I realised to my absolute horror that I'd got something really wrong. So when it came to the reprint, I was like, please, please change that sentence. Do not let that sit there, because I now know from new information that that sentence is not factually correct. But yeah, you can just post anything anywhere. And especially if it sounds plausible, if it sounds interesting, it sounds, oh, this is a little bit subversive, and it fits with people's preconceived ideas about something, it gets shared, and then suddenly it's fact when it isn't. And the widespread way we can do that today, it just didn't exist. Well, even 10 years ago, you didn't have that same level of access to spreading information, which is it has its place, but it's also quite terrifying, isn't it, on some level?
It is. I know Morgan Daimler, who obviously absolutely excellent scholar, had been on the podcast before. They've been talking a lot on Facebook about a lot of the misinformation that does the rounds about the Irish mythology and Irish figures. And sometimes it's shared because someone's just asked AI and hasn't fact checked it. And in other cases, the AI overview will take a bit from 3 or 4 different websites, which in and of themselves may have a point, and then the way it synthesizes those points is completely wrong. And I've come across this before where if you asked for some information about 2 castles in Northumbria, it then claimed there was a haunted road that connects them, but yet there is no road that connects them. And the haunted bit is actually 30 miles south, but
Mm.
it just took cherry picked from these
Yep.
articles and made something up. So if you read the AI overview, you would go, oh yeah, that
Mm.
must be right. And it's not. You've got to go into the original sources. But
Yep.
who's
Yes.
going to do that?
Yes.
Well, us
Yes.
obviously. I don't even use the AI overview. And
No.
just as a side issue, if anyone's listening to this and wonders how to get rid of the AI
Oh,
overview, you
yes.
put
Tell
your
me.
search
Tell me, I see.
you put your search term in and then just put minus AI at the end, and Google will just run an ordinary Google search and it doesn't do the AI overview.
Oh, wow. Okay. You have just made my day, my week, my month. I'm not quoting the Friends theme tune, but I'm nearly there. Oh, that is amazing. Seriously. Thank you.
Just turn it off. And the thing is, obviously, because it will always show you where it got its information from anyway. But I just think, yeah, but why waste the extra energy if I'm not going to look at it anyway? So I'll just turn it off. So that's my good deed of today. Hurrah.
Thank you.
But obviously, we've been talking about these different witchcraft figures and so on. And I know you said in the introduction to the story of witches that because of the word count, because it's such a massive topic, you are only having to sort of focus on Europe and America. So,
Mhm.
given the constraints, did you come across any goddesses or witch figures or anyone else that you really wanted to include, but you just didn't have the space for them?
Oh, there was so much. There was so, so much. I mean, it's probably a good thing that I had a word limit, because I'd still be writing it now, seriously. I'd just be like, I'm still working on this and it'll come out in 50 years' time. Um, but I mean, even just within the parameters that I set for it, there was still stuff that I just wish I would have loved to have delved into the ancient side of it a lot more. I was really sad that I couldn't fit Circe in, for instance, and a lot of like I got Hecate, and then there was lots of other goddesses and figures that I was like, yes, I want to include you, but I had to be quite ruthless, which was sad. I'd also have liked to have looked at witches and witch-like figures in art and other media a lot more. There were brief mentions throughout, but I would have liked to have done a really deep dive into, well, just, I mean, even just looking at artworks and paintings and things, it's, again, so much out there, so much that I just couldn't add. And then in the witch trials section, oh, so much material, because my main interest is often about the individual stories and the trials. So having to look at it more thematically and in less detail than I would usually do was a real challenge. And there was some very ruthless editing. There was nearly tears at various points. Because it's like, yes, here is a theme. I now want to include 6 different individual stories. And I couldn't. So I sort of contented myself with name dropping a few of my favourites here and there. But yeah, that
I
was a
think
lot.
thinking about the goddesses, it's literally just occurred to me. Did you sometimes find that you would get a goddess of magic, but it wasn't a thing associated with witchcraft? Whereas like Hecate is very much like a goddess of witches, but then if you look at someone like Isis, she's very much a goddess of magic, but there's
Mm,
absolutely because obviously they wouldn't have had the conception of witchcraft in the
yeah.
same way. So do you find that you end up where there's actually tons of gods and goddesses associated with magic, but actually very few associated with witches?
Yes, which was, again, it's one of those distinctions where you're initially, again, if you do a Google search, whatever, and you type in witchcraft goddesses or goddesses associated with witchcraft, it will give you this long list. And then you actually go and look and you're like, well, actually, no, because they didn't have a concept of witches when whoever was around. That one, it's a sorcerer, but if you actually go and look at the historical period in question, oh no, they again didn't have a concept of witchcraft as we see witchcraft. I mean, I almost needed a 40,000 word book just to explore all of those different strands and how the idea of the witch came about. And yeah, I had so many notes on that alone where I was like, no, there are books already written on this. This is not what your book is about. But no, it's like you say, again, those interesting dividing lines between witchcraft, um, magic, sorcery, and all of the just all the different terminology and everything. So yes, that was quite helpful in knowing who and what to include and not, because I could be quite ruthless and go, well, no, you don't. This one, for instance, doesn't tick all of those boxes. Hecate, you do. You get to stay. So yes, yes, definitely.
This is probably a really horrible question, and I seem to end up asking everybody if they've got a favourite. Did you come up with a favourite witchcraft figure, whether they're in the book or not? And if so, who are they and why are they your favourite?
Oh, again, with this one, there are so many, but I always default back to, probably for ease's sake, our local witch here was a woman called Anne Wagg. And in 1650, she was basically the local baker, went off to Derby to the assizes, and basically went and said, this woman is a witch, and gave evidence against her. And then a couple of days later, several other people trundled off and also gave their evidence. And basically, to cut a long story short, she was blamed for the death of a couple of local women, illness of the vicar's wife, death of livestock, the standard witchcraft accusations. Oh, she turned into a cat as well and glared at a maid and terrified her to the point where she couldn't move and was paralysed. But essentially, she was an outspoken middle aged widow who wasn't afraid to speak her mind. She was quarrelsome, probably not very well liked, had at least one illegitimate child. Her reputation wasn't good. And to the backdrop of the English Civil War and the period around, I mean, Derbyshire was quite badly hit around that time, like many other areas were. It was very unsettled times, and she, because of her history and everything, it all came out, and she was accused of being a witch. I think her story interests me so much because she was just, there's so little evidence and not very much source material at all, but what comes through is that she was a real person. She was an individual, didn't see herself as a witch. She was this victim of local tensions and disagreements. And I think that just sums up what interests me in witches and witchcraft in general. It's the people behind it. It's not so much the fanciful magical side of it. As interesting as though that is, it was just the fact that there's this woman who clearly spoke when she shouldn't do. She tried to buy some butter, possibly, or cheese, something. Anyway, she went to a neighbour and was like, I want to buy this from you. And she was told, basically, go away. Even though she had the money to do it, it was like, no, I'm saving this for someone else. And rather than just slinking off, and she said what she thought, and they had an argument about it. She just comes through loud and clear. And what I particularly love is, despite the Victorian historians keep going on about how she was undoubtedly burned and blah, 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 but no, the local church records show quite clearly she was buried in our churchyard several years after she was accused. So she was accused in 1650, and she lived a good few years after that and was buried in the local churchyard. It didn't go to trial, I think largely due to the fact it was later on in the period, 20 years beforehand. 50 years beforehand, the outcome might have been very different. She might have found herself convicted and executed, but it didn't really make it past the locals giving their evidence to the justices of the peace. And I just love the fact that she survived. I don't know, obviously there's no way of knowing how things went for her once she came back, once everything settled. Were people nice to her then? Was she shunned for the rest of, we don't know that, but just the fact that she made it, and she was clearly this very unapologetic woman who was just like, no, I'm me and I'm living my life and this is what I think and I will tell people what I think. I always have a soft spot for good old Anne Wag.
I always quite like the stories as well where someone's accused and then it doesn't end the way you think it's going to, because I think it's so easy to assume that like just simply being accused was a death sentence, and I think the number of stories where it actually wasn't, that's a side of the witch trials that I think we don't really hear very often, because obviously the focus is rightfully on the victims, but then you think, well, what about all these other people who still underwent all the stress and tension of that, but then it went a different way. So I always think it's quite nice to hear about them. And a lot of the time you do go, was it just because you were quite opinionated, or were you a bit crotchety? What's going on there? Because you think that would be me.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I do. I mean, with Anne Wag, one of the complaints against her from the baker who, kicked it all off, was that Anne had apparently, we don't know what she'd said, but she'd basically been talking about the baker and his wife behind their backs. And the maid who overheard it went home and told them. And then it got back to Anne that, she'd told them what she'd said. And then that was why she stood there. She stood outside the church with her arms folded and glared at the maid. And this was, so terrifying that she literally couldn't get out of bed. But so what Anne said about the baker is, I would love to know. I would love to know what it was she said that was so awful that the maid had to run back and tell her employees. But yeah.
Oh, I just think of the way that Facebook community groups sort of descend into drama, and you imagine if that was then, oh my God, what would they look like?
Oh goodness. No, I mean, being on or seeing the local Facebook group, and yeah, some of the stuff on there, oh my goodness, no. Yeah, that would definitely be a get the popcorn out moment, I think.
Oh, speaking of popcorn, as a side note, obviously one of the things I'm really fascinated with is how folklore and myth appear on screen. And I think witches and sorcerers have pretty much been a staple of cinema pretty much since its inception. And for anyone who's not sure what I mean by that, if you have a look for Le Manoir du Diable on YouTube, it's an example by Georges Méliès from 1897, and it's more of a sorcerer. It's not a witch at all, but it's still really interesting to see how someone handled special effects also in 1897. But it just shows there's been that fascination with sorcery because it works really well with special effects, let's be honest. But my question then is, do you have a favourite witch from film or TV? And if so, who is it?
You see, it's a tough one, and I'm probably going to be really boring and obvious in my answers for this one now. I do have to say that, and again, I'm literally aging myself here, Tara from Buffy. I'm sorry. Prior to that, my experience of witches on screen, etc., was very much, well, your stereotypical witch, so, Wizard of Oz kind of thing. And it was at that age, it was like, oh, okay, there's a whole other side to witches and witchcraft. Because, I mean, obviously, this was, again, dating myself here. This was, back in my mid-teens, I think, mid-teens-ish. And it felt at that time, it felt like something very new, very different. And it was, I think it was that point where the idea of the witch wasn't that traditional black hat cat broomstick evil person. It was part of that reinvention of and repackaging and presenting the image of the witch in a more positive way. And yeah, years on, that's always sort of stuck with me. And similarly, the film Practical Magic, I think probably for almost the same sort of reasons. I mean, this is me analysing it now. Back then, I wasn't sat there going, oh, why am I liking this? What am I finding different about it? But I remember with Practical Magic, I saw it several times in the cinema, and this was back when I was living at home. The nearest cinema was a 35 to 40-minute train journey away in Guildford. It wasn't just round the corner. But it came out a few days after, I think, my 16th birthday, and I'd always sort of liked stories about witches and family legends and things. And I think in both these cases, it's all just the positive side of it. The way it was packaged it felt very new and different to me. It might not have been, but that's how it felt. And I think that's why it's stuck with me. I've not watched either of those things in years, but apparently the sequel to Practical Magic is due out next year, apparently. So it might be time for a rewatch or two.
Interesting. I think I always liked Maleficent, but I hesitate to call her a witch because I think she's one of the fairies, so she's very much just a being of magic. But I think I always really liked Madam Mim in The Sword and the Stone.
Yes.
Because she's got like a bit of sort of, I don't know, something about her, and obviously the way she has that fantastic battle with Merlin, which is actually quite funny. Yeah, I think I always quite liked her. Because I think this is the thing, you look at a lot of witches and they're either now portrayed as sort of like really sexy and powerful or like old and crotchety. And I'm always kind of like, there's got to be some kind of in between. And obviously, I mean, in terms of novels, I'd have to go with Granny Weatherwax, but that's a completely different line of questioning. So back to the story of witches. Obviously, it's a very good introduction, I think, to people who are maybe interested in witchcraft and its history. But if people could only take away one thing from the book, what would you want it to be and why?
I think what I really want people to come away with, if it was just one thing, is the understanding that none of it, whether it's the ancient beliefs or the witch trials, none of it exists in a vacuum or is stuck in the past. You come across this sort of trend of where it's almost comforting to look back and go, well, that was clearly all due to religion and superstition of the past and everything. That's how people were then. People were uneducated and they didn't know any better. But it's actually all still so relevant today in how we treat each other as human beings, just on a basic level. And our collective witchcraft history is just I see it as one massive cautionary tale. And I think it's really important that people are aware of this and that we acknowledge it. I mean, whether we choose to heed it either individually or collectively is another matter entirely. But that for me, I think it was always there as kind of a thing in the back of my head, but especially in writing the story of witches, that was what really became apparent. And it was, no, we can't, it's not something you can relegate to the past. We're living some of this now with different people, different groups, different ideas, different words, but a lot of it is very current today. And I know you said one thing, but I also, on a slightly less depressing note, I really hope that people put the book down wanting to go and find out more. I don't want them to just finish it and then go, oh, well, that was nice. That's it now. I'm done. If somebody felt inspired to go out and seek out other books, other sources on any of the areas that have interested them, I'd love for it to be a stepping stone, sort of like a gateway to inspiring interest and passion in the topic on some level. So yeah, those would be I know you said one, but those would be my two takeaways that I'd like people to have.
As we sort of draw to a close, I know this particular figure that I wanted to talk about last isn't in this book, but she is an accused. And I wanted to ask about Helen Duncan, who has the somewhat dubious honour, I think, of being the last person in Britain to be tried and sentenced under the 1735 Witchcraft Act. So could you tell us a little bit about who Helen was and how she ended up being tried under a 200-year-old law?
Now, the material around Helen Duncan is a little bit misleading because although obviously she's often referred to as, the last witch, that's one of the big selling points around her. She wasn't actually convicted as a witch as such or for performing witchcraft. While earlier witchcraft legislation targeted the crime of witchcraft, the latest Witchcraft Act that she was tried under went the opposite way. People were convicted of pretending that they or someone else was a witch or bewitching someone else. So in essence, it was, the crime was saying, I can do this magical thing, I can do witchcraft, or saying that person there is a witch. You could be, a lot of people in the 1800s, for instance, found themselves very confused standing before a judge going, but that woman's a witch, and I accused her of being a witch. She killed my cow, she tormented my sister or whatever. And they're very confused to find themselves, they were in the wrong and having to pay a fine to the person they were accusing, because before that act it would have been the other way around. The person accused would have been the one convicted, whereas then it was the accusers that were then finding themselves in hot water. And that was a change that I think it's very clear that people struggled with that idea. But it was under this act that Helen Duncan was convicted, essentially for pretending that was said to have pretended to be able to contact the dead. Now, Helen Duncan was a spiritualist medium, and she became quite famous for her seances where she was said to make contact with the dead, and they often appeared in a form of ectoplasm from beyond the grave to speak through Helen to those attending. And they've got lots of stories of people saying that their loved ones had basically either materialized in one of these seances or spoken through Helen. And she brought a lot of comfort to a lot of people. And there were also a lot of people who said, no, she's a fraud, this is all rubbish, something needs to be done about it. Basically, on the 25th of November 1941, a British battleship, the HMS Barham, was sunk by a German U-boat. 861 people died, sadly. The news wasn't released to the public immediately, or even to the families of those who had died. But later that month, according to how the story goes, Helen Duncan was carrying out a séance when contact was made with a man who was recognised as a sailor from the Barham, mostly because he had a hat on which said HMS Barham on it. And he told a woman in the audience that the ship had sunk and that he and many others had died. Now, obviously, during wartime, it obviously wasn't a good thing for some random medium to be spilling official secrets before they were public knowledge. So she, again, as the story goes, became a person of interest around that point. And you fast forward to January 1944, she was doing another séance down in Portsmouth. Basically, Helen was set up. Two men in the audience were there with the intention of catching her out in act of fraud, and there were detectives waiting to arrest her. It all turned into a bit of a scuffle. Helen lost a shoe in the process. There's lots of conflicting stories about what actually happened, but she was essentially arrested and taken away. And she was arrested originally under the Vagrancy Act, which said that every person pretending or professing to tell fortunes, or using any subtle craft, means, or device to deceive or impose on any of His Majesty's subjects shall be deemed a rogue or a vagabond. But when she came to court later on in that year, however, quite interestingly, the charges had been reframed, and she was charged under the Witchcraft Act, which stated that anyone pretending to exercise or use any kind of witchcraft, sorcery, enchantment, or conjuration was guilty. Now, the difference between the two acts was the penalty for being convicted under it. The Witchcraft Act, if she was found guilty, which she was, would result in 12 months imprisonment. So after a 7 days trial where there were over 30 witnesses, Helen was found guilty and was imprisoned. I think she served 9 months in the end. And there's a few theories about why she was imprisoned and what had led to this. Now, obviously, the obvious and least sensational one is the simplest. She was guilty as charged. She was defrauding people who attended her seances, preying on vulnerable victims, and the authorities had had enough. They were clamping down and wanted to make an example of her. It wasn't the first time she'd been in trouble. There are various incidents where people have made accusations against her, or where she'd ended up, having quite a vigorous, violent altercation with someone who doubted her. And it could just be that, her luck had run out. She'd reached the end of tolerance. But there's another theory that, and it's a tricky one. This is one that really grabs people's attention, and it's like, is it a conspiracy theory? I don't know if which way you'd call it, but it's definitely the more interesting idea, is that actually the authorities were genuinely concerned that she had the powers she said she had, and that after her revelation about the Barham sinking, they were concerned she would either inadvertently or intentionally, in a breach of defence secrets kind of way, leak other information. Now, much has been made of the fact that her arrest and imprisonment coincided with the lead up to D-Day, and the theory goes that she was imprisoned in order to make sure she didn't leak information and essentially put the whole operation in jeopardy. I mean, I don't have in my head at the moment all of the different theories, but there's lots of people have poured over all the evidence, all of the documents out there, and there's strong speculation that essentially they wanted her locked up and out of the way to avoid that happening. And yeah, there's lots more in it, but that's the essence of the main story, so to speak.
So obviously, I think she's probably less well known among people who are interested in witches than someone like, for example, Isabel Gowdy in the Scottish witch trials. And is that most likely because of the fact that Helen was really associated with spiritualism rather than witchcraft, but they were just having to use this Witchcraft Act because it was the closest thing that they had to hand? Because I always feel like that Witchcraft Act strikes me as like early trading standards more than anything else. So it's like, is it because she was deemed in, I guess, what you would consider acceptable in the seance room, as it were, compared to being like what we might consider a proper witch, if that's the right term?
I think, yeah, largely I would agree with you there. And I think also, like popular perception and stuff, people still generally a lot of the time and at that time think of witches, they think of the 16th and 17th century, they think of Matthew Hopkins, and it's that sort of era. And the idea that belief in witchcraft and witches carried on long after that isn't something that people necessarily are aware of. And I think being a figure from the 20th century, and it was a more modern case, she doesn't naturally fit with everybody's image of a witch as easily. And also the charges against her and the seances and the spiritualism, especially because of the rise of spiritualism at that time. She was a product and a person of her time. People weren't looking for witches at that point. People weren't The witch wasn't the bogeyman anymore at that point. It was almost like the witch was outdated at that point, and spiritualism and that movement and being able to converse with the dead and everything had sort of taken over. So largely, yes, 100 years, 200 years beforehand, she might very well have been accused of being a witch. I mean, given what we know of her personality and everything, actually shares a lot in common with what I was saying about Anne Wag earlier. Actually, she, from the sources, she doesn't seem to have been. She was a complicated woman. She was a difficult woman in many ways. She wasn't afraid to speak her mind. She didn't fit with the conventions of, the gentle, quiet, feminine qualities that apparently are still very much lumped on women. She didn't fit with that, and she was kind of, I always think of her as sort of a Marmite figure. I think people either loved her and were devoted to her entirely, or couldn't stand her in some really quite visceral manner, which really comes off the page in some of the things that have been written about her since. And yeah, I think when people think of Helen Duncan today, if they've heard of her, it's usually the fact of her seances, speaking to the dead, and the accusations of fraud and things which aren't generally linked with witchcraft in our imaginations these days. And I think it's only because she was tried under that Witchcraft Act that there's a link between her and witches at all. But I do find it really interesting that by dint of that, because she was tried under that act, and then looking at the similarities between her as a person and people previously convicted as witches, you can almost see that, yeah, different time, different place, she fits into that category.
Mm. She's an interesting figure because, yeah, it is difficult to like her in a lot of ways. But I think it is interesting to see how they kind of resurrect this law for whatever reason, whichever theory you're going for. And it does then mean that she gets slotted into that narrative when, if they'd used a different law, she probably would have disappeared off into history and just been like a curious story or something.
Yeah,
See, this is why history is not an easy black and white binary, is it? It is full
no,
of nuance and shades of grey.
very, very much so. And obviously she was, it wasn't too much longer after that that the Witchcraft Act was obsolete anyway because the Fraudulent Mediums Act came in. There were similarities, but no, the word, that was the word witchcraft was no longer on our statute books anymore. The word witchcraft and witches had been in English law from the 1500s, and in the middle of the 1900s, when that previous Witchcraft Act went and the Fraudulent Mediums Act came in, that was the first time in, my maths is not my strong point, however many hundreds of years, where the word witchcraft was no longer in English law anymore. So she was there right at that end point, like the death knell, no pun intended, sorry, she was known as Hellish Nels, and I'm like, yes, Helen Duncan struck the death knell of the witchcraft and the figure of the witch in a negative sense, and witchcraft being a crime. She was there and instrumental in that in a way. So
I thought she was quite an interesting one to kind of end on, because she just demonstrate how much in flux I think ideas of witches are, can be, maybe should be, and also how can you necessarily apply legal precedents to things like that, because obviously if you have to provide evidence and proof, then that becomes a bit more difficult, I think, and so on. So what are you working on next, and where can people find you online?
Well, I'm in the process of signing a contract for my next project, so I can't technically disclose details of that one yet, but at the start of May I submitted the manuscript for working title Curious Cats and Fantastical Felines, Cats in Folklore, Myth and Legend, which was a lovely way to spend the last year working on. It was one of my I don't know if you have writing dream projects, but writing a book on cat folklore was definitely on my list of that. So that was lovely to work on, and it's due to be published in spring next year. So I'm really looking forward to sharing that with everybody. And as for where you can find me, well, currently the best place to catch up with me is on Blue Sky, where I think I'm there as Willow Winsham. I'll
put a link.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's usually what I use on most things. I don't think there's a dot or anything. I think it is just Willow Winsham. I'm currently in the process of very nearly finishing having my website updated, which is willowwinsham.com. So it's not currently up and running, but it will be very soon. So yes, that would also then be the best place to catch up with any news or information on what's going on.
Awesome. As I said, I'll put links in the show notes, because obviously sometimes it's easier to just click on stuff and so on. And the captions on when I do this for YouTube always go a bit funny when you start reading web addresses out, and it gets a little bit like, I'm not sure what I'm doing, and it's quite funny. But that's a complete side issue. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. It's always nice to talk about witches and witchcraft with people, particularly someone like you who's done so much research into them. So thank you very much for coming on.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been lovely to talk about a subject that, well, I say we're both very interested in. Hopefully other people will be too.
Cool. I'll speak to you soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee. Or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance. Well, hello there. I'm just hopping on to do another book review of this beauty. Look at that, it's got a shiny cover, and I really am that easily amused. So this is The Story of Witches, Folklore, History and Superstition by Willow Winsham. And I love Willow. Obviously I've known Willow for a really long time as part of Folklore Thursday, and I was sent this as a review copy, but what follows is my honest review, because otherwise what's the point? And this is a gorgeous book, it really is. It's by Batsford and it's illustrated, and basically it's split into 3 sections. So you've got witches in like the ancient era, so like Hecate and figures like that are in here. Then you've got more of like the witch trials period and kind of witch persecution and things like that. And then you've got a section at the end which is, I guess, the contemporary area to a degree, but that also engages with things like the impact of Margaret Murray's work, which I would argue is a bad thing, but there we go. And it's got people like Gerald Gardner, Doreen Valiente, figures like that who had an impact on contemporary witchcraft via the likes of Wicca and so on as well. So it does cover quite a wide range and spectrum. Obviously, it can't necessarily be as in-depth as you might like on certain topics because it's like an introductory text to these different areas. But I did want to show you one of my favourite illustrations. And how cool is this? The book actually has a ribbon. You have no idea how much I love ribbon bookmarks because I otherwise just use bus tickets. But I just absolutely love that hair. And this is obviously in the section about the idea that witches could turn into hares and things like that, particularly that we get with people like Isabel Gowdy and things like that. But, you know, she's got sections on all sorts. We've got Dianic Wicca there as well. So there's a beautiful illustration of Diana. And it's a really easy read. And I think if you are not necessarily new to this particular area, then you might sort of look at it and go, oh, it's a nice book. It condenses a lot of topics into one area. But what I would say is it's a really good introduction for people who are maybe expressing an interest in witchcraft for like the first time or anything like that. So I think it would be a good present for sort of younger people in your life, I think, who are just coming into an interest in this kind of thing. So it's a good place to start, and then you can branch off. Obviously, Willow has got other books on witches as well. So there's the Accused one that's very, very good, and the English Witch Trials one, which is also very good. So there are other books that you can look at by Willow if you want like follow-on texts that look into these different cases. So I think that this one in particular is more of an introduction. But because of that, I do think these books are necessary because I still see people making the same mistakes over and over again. The other day, somebody had left a negative review on Tabitha Stanmore's Cunning Folk because of the fact that she mentioned that cunning folk and like midwives and healers and things weren't being accused of witchcraft en masse, which I know is the popular idea, despite, again, the fact it's been debunked. So I think that's where books like this are really necessary. So if you're going to get your witchcraft history from somewhere, I would rather you got it from an actual witchcraft historian like Willow or Marion Gibson or Tabitha Stanmore or Owen Davies or any of these other wonderful historians. Like I say, really, really good book, really easy to read. I read it in about 3 or 4 days, I think. Because the chapters are all very short, it's really easy to dip in and out of as well. So if you're the kind of person who likes to be able to sort of snack on a book, then this is really good. And as I say, the illustrations are just absolutely beautiful as well. So it's also a nice book to look at as well, which is always worth bearing in mind. So I'm just looking because there's a couple of other ones that I really liked as well. I mean, how cool is that one of the devil? I mean, I genuinely think this would make an absolutely cracking set of tarot cards as well if someone did a tarot deck in this style, but that's a side issue. That's like a wish list item more than anything. But I really, really, really enjoyed it, really recommend it, and it'd be interesting to see what you think if you've read it, so let me know.